I'd like to welcome everyone for joining our webinar on our newest report, Community Health Impacts of Air Pollution in the United States. Just a few housekeeping notes. All participants have been muted to limit the background noise during the presentation, but that doesn't mean we don't want to hear from you. There are two ways to engage during the webinar. Please use the chat box for commentary and support needs, technical needs, and then the Q&A box for questions for our panelists at the end of the session. Also, as you might have heard, this presentation is being recorded. So after the webinar, I'll send out an email with a report and a link to the recording. You can expect to receive it within a couple of days. The report and webinar will also be available on the CATF website. And over the next week or so, we're actually creating a landing page for all of our reports associated with the Climate Equity Initiative in one location. So that should be very convenient. By way of background, Clean Air Task Force is a global nonprofit organization working to safeguard against the worst impacts of climate change. With over 25 years of internationally recognized expertise on climate policy, science, and law, and a commitment to exploring all potential solutions, CATF is a pragmatic, non-ideological advocacy group focused on climate change and the clean energy transition. CATF launched the Climate Equity Initiative in May of 2021 to conduct research and analysis and to work with environmental justice leaders, advocates, and community residents to identify barriers, challenges, and potential opportunities in environmental justice communities, advocate changes and adoption of solutions to systemic barriers and challenges that create and perpetuate environmental injustice, particularly in the context of environmental and climate policies and practices, and ensure that CATF itself has a clear-sighted understanding of the needs and concerns of environmental justice communities, particularly those most directly impacted by the clean energy transition, and with their input, develop tools and initiatives to help ensure they have a powerful voice at the table in the transition to a just, clean energy future. Today's program will consist of speaker introductions, a presentation of the reports, and a panel discussion followed by Q&As. Community health impacts of air pollution in the U.S. focuses on the contributions of the energy and transportation sectors to air pollution and the role of the Clean Air Act in addressing these emissions. It especially identifies that despite dramatic reduced air pollution in the U.S., many Americans, especially in low-income and minority communities, remain exposed to dangerous levels of air pollution. I'm pleased to introduce today's speakers. Pargal Arab is the report's author, and she has been a Climate Equity Associate at Clean Air Task Force. Pargal is currently pursuing a master's at the Yale School of Public Health with an interest on how air pollution and climate change impact public health. Veronica Saltzman is one of the report's editors. Veronica is the Wendy Jacobs Legal Fellow at Clean Air Task Force, and she has a law degree from Harvard University. Maria Lopez Nunez is the Deputy Director for Organizing and Advocacy at the Ironbound Community Corporation. She's a member of the first White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council, and she's an environmental justice organizer and plays a large role in advocating and uplifting her community while also pushing for policies to address environmental injustice locally, regionally, and nationally. Dr. Jacoby Wilson is a professor at the Maryland Institute for Applied Environmental Health and the Department of Epidemiology and Biostatistics at the School of Public Health at the University of Maryland in College Park. Dr. Wilson is also the director of the Center for Community Engagement, Environmental Justice and Health, which is focused on providing technical assistance and research support to communities fighting against environmental injustice and environmental health disparities. Last but not least, Catherine Pruitt is the National Senior Director for Policy at the American Lung Association. She currently directs national policy initiatives on outdoor and indoor air quality and serves as the project lead for the Lung Association's seminal annual report, State of the Air, in addition to her work on environmental health and lung disease. I will now start the PowerPoint and invite Pargal and Veronica to provide an overview of the report, Community Health Impacts of Air Pollution in the U.S. Pargal, would you care to begin?
Hello, everyone. On the offer of the community health impacts of air pollution in the US, I'll cover the key takeaways and just the health impact. So, this paper or report focuses on how the energy and transportation sectors contribute to air pollution in the US, and it identifies the largest sources of air pollution, describes the health impacts, summarize the air emissions from these sectors, and we'll also cover the Clean Air Act and this some of its key programs, and this the standards behind them, and also how environmental justice communities face disproportionate impacts from air pollution. And we'll also cover 3 case studies that relates to this. So according to the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences, air pollution is a major health threat. It is responsible for 6.5 million deaths each year globally. Despite the many benefits of Clean Air Act, Americans still experience unhealthy levels of air pollution in the US. Although the Clean Air Act have significantly reduced the air pollution, but there are still areas in the US where it exceeds the standard levels under the Clean Air Act. Some research indicate that the existing air pollution status is still not enough to protect public health. And there are significant exposure disparities, especially related to people of color and low-income communities. For example, according to this report, it found that majority groups and low-income populations of 53% and 49% more likely live in a place where particular matter levels are above the NOx level. Also, according to the American Lung Association, 8 million people who live in counties with unhealthy levels of ozone, PM 2.5, or people of color, 72%. According to another report, over 1 million African Americans live in counties with a risk of cancer for toxins emitted by natural gas facilities. More than 6.7 million African Americans live in counties in the US with oil refineries. So the US has air quality monitoring systems. It's really extensive, and it's like the most extensive in any country. However, it mainly measures regional trends in air pollution across large geographic areas. These models do not fully capture spatial temporal variation in air pollution, so it may miss temporary spikes and geographic hotspots of air pollution, such as near a fossil fuel plant. So it doesn't fully capture the true levels of exposure to air pollution and disparities between people of color in this exposure. There are also criteria pollutants, such as PM 2.5, ozone, lead, CO, NO2, and SO2. So, but especially ozone and PM 2.5, they have major health impacts. And there has been discussions about making stricter regulations for these two pollutants. So the energy and transportation sector contributes the most to air pollution in the US. For example, in 2015, these sectors emitted the highest amount of SO2, NOx, and PM 2.5. Then burning coal in general releases many harmful pollutants, such as PM 2.5, NOx, metals, and other substances. So air pollution from coal plants are linked to asthma, respiratory diseases, cardiovascular diseases, kidney diseases, and many more. So natural gas plants do not generate as much as PM 2.5 mercury and SO2 compared to coal plants, but they do generate NOx emissions, which can lead to ozone and PM 2.5 formation. Also, natural gas plants release methane, which leaks. It contributes to ozone formation. It also emits VOCs, SO2s, and other hazardous air pollutants, which can lead to other health issues, such as mental health issues, asthma episodes, breathing issues, leukemia, irritation, heart disease, and many more. So overall, exposure to air pollution is responsible for many health impacts. It's mainly known for leading respiratory and cardiovascular diseases, premature mortality, impacts on the mental health, increase cancer, it weakens immune systems, and it could harm pregnancies. And as I mentioned before, there's a criteria pollutants, and it's regulated under the Clean Air Act. There are standards for each of these pollutants. And there's also a separate standard for hazardous air pollutants, which includes benzene and mercury. Next, Veronica will cover the Clean Air Act. Thank you.
Thanks, Pargal. So I'm just going to give an overview of some of the main portions of the Clean Air Act that are relevant here. So the 1970 Clean Air Act amendments established the basic architecture of the US air pollution control system, and for the first time gave the federal government a serious regulatory role in protecting the environment, which is something traditionally left to states. Congress passed further amendments to the Clean Air Act in 1977 and 1990, each time tightening emission standards and adding different requirements to clean up air pollution. The Clean Air Act sets out different categories of air pollutants and directs the EPA to enact regulations to control those pollutants. So the 1970 Clean Air Act amendments required the establishment and implementation of National Ambient Air Quality Standards, also known as NAQS. Specifically, Section 108 of the Act directed the administrator of the EPA to publish a list of air pollutants that contribute to pollution, which may reasonably be anticipated to endanger public health or welfare. The EPA came up with the following 6 pollutants: sulfur dioxide, particulates, carbon monoxide, ozone, nitrogen oxides, and lead. Section 108 of the Clean Air Act requires EPA to issue air quality criteria for these pollutants, which reflect the latest scientific knowledge on their health and welfare effects. As Pargal already discussed, these pollutants cause serious localized health impacts in communities where they are emitted. Section 109 directs EPA to set NAQS for these pollutants. The primary air quality standards, which are intended to protect public health while secondary standards protect public welfare, must protect public health with an adequate margin of safety based on the criteria. When setting standards for these 6 pollutants, EPA can only consider health effects. It cannot consider the cost of meeting the standards. In implementing the standards, EPA first reviews air quality data to determine which parts of the country have pollution levels above or below the revised NAQS. It designates areas that comply with the NAQS as attainment and those that do not comply as non-attainment. Once EPA sets standards for these 6 pollutants, states must create their own plans to meet the standard. If a state fails to address these pollutants in a state implementation plan, EPA must step in with a federal implementation plan to address these pollutants. The NAQS are the foundation for much of the Clean Air Act and have driven much of the improvements in air quality that have been achieved under the Act. Along with setting air quality standards for these 6 criteria pollutants, the Clean Air Act the Clean Air Act requires EPA to set emission standards for stationary sources of hazardous air pollutants, also known as HAPs. There are currently around 188 pollutants listed as HAPs. Think of things like benzene, chloroform, or mercury. Because these listed pollutants are so toxic, even in small amounts, EPA must set extremely stringent standards for them. Other important provisions of the Clean Air Act include new source performance standards, which are minimum emission standards for major stationary sources like large power plants. They can regulate non-criteria pollutants such as greenhouse gases. The standard of performance must reflect a degree of emission limitation achievable through application of the best system of emission reduction. Next, Title II of the Clean Air Act directs EPA to regulate air pollution from all types of mobile sources, including cars, boats, trains, and planes. Different parts of Title II regulate both the fuels used in mobile sources, as well as the emissions from the tailpipe. Consider, for example, regulating the use of lead in gasoline. EPA used the Clean Air Act to limit lead used in fuel, but EPA also sets what are called tailpipe standards for certain pollutants emitted from the mobile sources themselves, such as nitrogen oxides or NOx and particulate matter, both of which are emitted in large quantities from diesel-fueled vehicles. Title II is also unique in that it mostly preempts states from enacting their own fuel or emission standards and instead grants the federal government the power to set national mobile source standards. The idea here is that it would be difficult to comply with 50 different mobile source standards since the sources are quite literally moving. This makes federal mobile source standards extremely important for curbing harmful pollutions from mobile sources. The exception to this, of course, is California, which may enact its own mobile source standards under the Clean Air Act, although this is being challenged in court as we speak. And states may adopt California's mobile source standards, which is another avenue for pollution reduction under the Clean Air Act. Along with regulating mobile sources, the Clean Air Act has the New Source Review Program, which is a pre-construction review and permitting process for new or modified sources of air pollution. And finally, Title V of the Clean Air Act establishes a permitting structure that states run for stationary sources that incorporates the source's Clean Air Act requirements. So we can go to the next slide. Thanks. So the positives of the Clean Air Act. Pollution has dramatically decreased since Congress passed the Clean Air Act. Since 1970, emissions of criteria and precursor pollutants in the US have dropped by 78%. Between 1990 and 2022, other harmful pollutant concentrations also dropped significantly, with carbon monoxide falling by 81%, ground level ozone by 22%, and lead by 88% from 2010. Next slide, please. Thank you. EPA has also quantified enormous benefits attributable to the 1990 Clean Air Act amendment programs. In EPA's second prospective study of benefits and costs of the Clean Air Act, the agency estimated that the Clean Air Act amendments would be responsible for preventing over 230,000 early deaths in 2020 and significantly reducing the frequency of respiratory diseases. But as we're talking about, despite this progress, millions of people are still exposed to dangerous pollutants. The American Lung Association's 2023 State of the Air report found that 119.6 million people in the US live in places with failing grades for unhealthy levels of ozone or particulate pollution. This exposure disproportionately harms Black, Latino, Indigenous, Asian, and other communities of color, as well as low-income communities across the country. As Pargel noted, for example, according to the Lung Association, of the 18 million people who live in counties with unhealthy levels of ozone, short-term PM 2.5 and annual PM 2.5, 72% are people of color. Additionally, the Clean Air Task Force has analyzed the health consequences from diesel vehicle emissions. In CATF's death by dirty diesel mapping, we found the emissions from diesel pollution led to more than 8,800 deaths, 3,700 heart attacks, and hundreds of thousands of respiratory illnesses in 2023. And it is well documented, including by EPA and other studies, that these emissions disproportionately harm people of color and low-income communities. Highways and polluting facilities have historically been sited in or next to low-income neighborhoods and communities of color, creating disproportionate health impacts for these communities. Research using satellite data to assess the health burdens from nitrogen dioxide pollution in 52 cities across the US found that diesel NOx emissions are the dominant source of pollution disparities across race, ethnicity, and income. So while the Clean Air Act has led to major decreases in dangerous air pollution, much more work is required to ensure that all people can breathe clean air. This is particularly difficult given that the EPA is woefully underfunded, a remnant of the Trump years. So with that, I will now turn it back to Pargal to discuss several case studies that highlight the need for greater and more equitable enforcement of the Clean Air Act.
Thank you, Veronica.
Hello. So in this report, I cover 3 case studies. One is San Pablo Bay Port. It's the port of LA and Long Beach. So it's a community that's impacted from the pollution from the transportation hub. And the second one is the Ironbound community. This is in New Jersey. It faces multiple transportation-related pollution sources, and also the waste to energy incinerator. The final one is Petersburg, Indiana. It's a community that's impacted from coal plants in the county. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so what I'd like to do is start. First, thank you, Pargal, and Veronica for your presentation. And I'd like to start with our panel by asking Catherine, what has been happening in the US on air quality based on your findings with the American Lung Association's 24th State of the Art report, as well as what's been consistent with our paper?
Okay, thanks, Jeanette. As you've heard from Veronica and Pargal, there is some information about the State of the Air report in Clean Air Task Force's report, which we certainly appreciate. But I'll have some things to add, I think. The findings in our most recent State of the Air report confirm the findings in the Clean Air Task Force report that the Clean Air Act is working for the most part, and widespread ambient air pollution has improved over the last couple of decades, but we know that not all communities have benefited equally from these improvements. For those of you who aren't familiar with the State of the Air report, the American Lung Association's State of the Air 2023 was the 24th annual edition of this report, which really has become a go-to resource about the quality of the air we're breathing for clean air advocates, decision makers, the media, and the public over that time. Each year, we use the 3 most recent years of publicly available quality assured data from EPA to assign grades to counties and ranks to metropolitan areas for the 2 most widespread and dangerous air pollutants, particulate matter and ozone. Because we've been doing the report consistently over the last 24 years, we can clearly see the changes that have occurred over that time. In most parts of the country, as was illustrated in the task force report, there have been dramatic improvements in both ozone and PM 2.5 over the last 2 decades. If you go to the county or city report card pages on our website, lung.org/SOTA, we include a trend line of the weighted average number of bad air days for each report for both pollutants. In most places, the line slopes more or less steadily downward as the new air pollution controls have taken effect over time. But beginning in around 2016, 2017, depending on the part of the country, that line starts to tick back up again, especially for particulate matter, because we're starting to see the results of climate change-driven heat, drought, and wildfires starting to reverse that healthy trend. Another trend that we've seen in recent years is, and this is also climate related, is a widening disparity between air quality in eastern and western states, again, particularly for particulate matter. This appears to be the result of a combination of reduction in emissions on the one hand and climate change fueled increases in pollution on the other hand. So in the early years of the report, the historically urban industrialized eastern and Midwestern states, such as New Jersey, New York, and Ohio, dominated the list of worst places for particle pollution in those early years. And thanks to the cleanup of power generation and industry, they're now all getting passing grades, in those three states. But when particle pollution was first added to the State of the Air report in 2004, fewer than half of the counties that got failing grades for PM were in 8 states west of the Rocky Mountains. But in State of the Air 2023, 111 counties in 19 states got Fs for this measure, and all but 8 of those were in the West. So there's been this geographic shift. Another unfortunate change that we've seen in the recent years is a sharp spike in the number of days of hazardous levels of air pollution, really bad air, purple and maroon days on the air quality index. In this last year's report, 32 million people across 10 states experienced purple, or very unhealthy, or maroon, hazardous days for fine particle pollution. And that's really unprecedented in the whole history of the state of the air. A couple of years ago, we first started including demographics in our population data. So we only have a handful of years of data on how race and ethnic groups are exposed to air pollution, in our report. But as soon as we started collecting it, we could clearly see that people of color are at disproportionate risk of living in areas with unhealthy air. You heard from Pargol and Veronica that some of the statistics that we include in our report. So I don't really need to reiterate those here. But I do want to say that because we look at county level data, that's the methodology in our report, what we can see in the way of disparities and inequitable exposures is really only scratching the surface. And we know that when you look at a more granular level at communities, at fence line communities, at people who live along highways and exposed to ports and transportation depots, those exposure inequities get much worse. And I'm really looking forward to hearing more from the other presenters about their findings and their recommendations. So I hope that gives you sort of an overview from the Lung Association. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Catherine. So Dr. Wilson, you're a national expert on environmental health disparities, especially impacts on underserved, socially and economically disenfranchised and marginalized communities. Can you talk about your work in this space and also tell us a little bit about some of the topics that you're covering in your, I think it's a September annual event for your organization?
Yeah, no, thank you. Happy to be here today. For me, this report is not, it is it's sobering, but it's things that we already know. And as was mentioned, that, you're looking at these trends at the county level. If you go to the hyperlocal level, you're going to see disparities in, the burden of mobile and stationary sources of air pollution, disparities in exposure to criteria and hazardous air pollutants. Particulate matter is a very important one. In my work, we've been measuring PM in hyperlocal air quality monitor networks in communities across the country, particularly the Mid-Atlantic. So working in Cheverly, Maryland, for example, with the Maryland Department of Environment, to look at PM exposure using low-cost sensors, working with colleagues, Kim Gaddy and her folks with SWIA a little bit the last few years to do some air quality monitoring using low-cost sensors. Also provided support to groups in the DC area who are looking at, traffic-related air pollutants and using low-cost sensors. So when you go down to a more hyper-local level, you're definitely, we've definitely seen these disparities. colleagues like my Dr. Susan Annenberg using satellite data, seeing more refined differences in NO2 and other pollutants. Companies like Aclima, even if you look at them using mobile monitoring approaches, which is more rigorous in many ways, you're going to see major differences at the block level of criteria air pollutants and also hazardous air pollutants. That work has been shown in DC, New York. Of course, and a lot of the works is Aclima based in California, So, I mean, for me, what's important to note, these issues are kind of baked into our system of how we plan zone development. Inequities in planning zone development, have really led to these issues. So you think about inequities driven by segregation and redlining and how transportation systems, and then also you think about energy injustice, most classic environmental justice issues. I'm an environmental justice researcher and advocate, right? So most classic environmental justice issues are energy justice issues, right? You look at the continuum of the energy sector, the oil and gas sector in this country, when it comes to extraction, to refinement, right? Processing, to transport, also to combustion, whose communities are disproportionately burdened by those facilities, whose communities are disproportionately impacted by the combustion byproduct. So whether it be the worker NAACP, others, Maria's gonna talk about her work in the Ironbound community and other EJ advocates across the country, they know this, right? So I think part of what we need to be doing, and I feel like this conversation is not necessarily an old conversation. It's great to have the data, right? It's great to have more data. But if the data is not being transferred to action, in many ways, that can be a form of contributing to the problem, right? So we have all this data. The EPA is doing all this work. The EPA, in some ways, is making progress on cumulative impacts, which is a very important framework to think about. When you think about the cumulative impacts of mobile and stationary sources, but are they actually pushing forward and providing a framework for cumulative impacts to be integrated into policy? We have states across the country that have done work to integrate cumulative impacts into policy, passing new legislation. If you look at states like New York, New Jersey, of course, Maria will talk more about that. You look at cities like Chicago, other states like, of course, Minnesota have been pushing on integrating, Massachusetts as well, integrating cumulative impacts and air pollution permitting. I think that's where the Clean Air Act has failed. The Clean Air Act has not done the job for the most susceptible and most vulnerable populations. Okay, susceptibility is intrinsic, right? You're older, you're young, you're pregnant. Vulnerability is outside of you, the most socially and geographically vulnerable folks, right? Economically vulnerable population. So I think, the state laws are actually making more progress to make the Clean Air Act actually have more impact. And we need to see that type of effort. And I also want to include California, some progress made as well there, particularly when you bring in some of the climate change issues, even though the cap and trade programs highly problematic. Not going to co-sign on that, y'all. But in general, we do see some progress in some states in pushing more progressive policies. In the state of Maryland, we just passed the Climate Solution Now Act, which supposes the most progressive climate law in the country, which hopefully will help deal with greenhouse gas emissions and those co-pollutants, right? When we think about climate change, it's not just greenhouse gases. When it comes to public health, we're talking about particular matter in the report, how it leads to, more asthma attacks, heart disease, right? It impacts, contributes to Alzheimer's, it impacts blood pressure, right? Contributes to diabetes, birth defects, right? Low birth weight babies, infant mortality, causes cancer, reduces life expectancy, right? Your zip code is more important than your genetic code. Where you live matters, place matters. Where you live can kill you, okay? What's also important is, well, noted in the report, you think about air pollution, diesel. We have many communities or frontline fence-line communities who are dealing with diesel, right? Dirty diesel corridors. Black carbon is a major constituent, but unlike PM, it is not covered by a national ambient air quality standard. That is a gap in the Clean Air Act. So you think about procedural justice issue, in some ways, you have a procedural injustice because you don't have a major pollutant included that we know that kills. Children riding on dirty diesel school buses, people have dirty diesel bus depots, folks have dirty diesel big trucks because they live in the ports. That is a major EJ issue. So I'll say this and pass the mic to Maria, so I'm getting a little excited. So what we do at our symposium, we bring together communities in the Mid-Atlantic region to talk about these issues, right? We try to, engage with frontline defense communities to share their stories. We have a number of sessions related to air quality and basically helping communities, empower them. I talk about empowerment science. So doing community-based air quality monitoring with frontline, fence line organizations. We've also done monitoring in South Carolina with the Low Country Alliance for Model Communities. So this long-term work of having community groups drive the work, that's what we try to highlight at the symposium. We also try to highlight, issues around policy. So we've had a series of sessions, particularly last symposium on cumulative impacts. I believe Maria participated in one of those sessions at the symposium on cumulative impacts. And again, that is part of the cumulative impact science, is where we need to be pushing on how we address these air pollution issues. I'm on the cumulative impacts working group. I'm a member of the EPA Science Advisory Board, liaison to NEJAC, the National Environmental Justice Advisory Council, and that working group has been led by Charles Lee. And so we're talking about these issues of cumulative impacts, particularly around air quality issues. And so I'll say more later, but the symposium, these type of meetings are very important for community voices to be heard. And in that symposium, we also have legislators there. So we try to bring residents who are impacted with legislators working on bills to make sure we have the community's voices integrated into the bills and decision making. So that's a form of recognition of justice. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Also, I think it's pretty impressive that you have a combination. You have your program is hybrid, so there's quite a range of virtual access as well as the in-person. So okay, I look forward to hearing more. So Maria, so nationally, the air quality has become cleaner and under the Clean Air Act, but many communities, as you know, more than many people, experience significant health challenges associated with air pollution. And can you talk about what's happening and been happening historically in Ironbound with the range of these pollution sources, and also talk about your success in the 2020 New Jersey environmental justice law, and what you're thinking on in terms of clean energy definitions in legislation, please. Thank you.
Thank you. Honor to be on here. But thinking about Ironbound's a neighborhood in Newark. So I think it's always important to start with that context. We're a 4-square-mile neighborhood where and we're in the Northeast, right, in New Jersey. Not, I think sometimes people just associate heavy industrial pollution with places like Cancer Alley, but they exist in every state, right? So in Newark, New Jersey, we're home to the state's largest garbage incinerator, the state's largest sewage waste treatment facility, which processes the waste of 12 different states. We are surrounded by the longest Superfund site in the country, the Passaic River, which is where, when we produced Agent Orange during the Vietnam War, we were dumping dioxin right into our river and having that spread throughout our whole neighborhood. We have 3 power plants. And we're right next to the largest port on the East Coast, the Newark Elizabeth Port, right? Which the amount of trucks that barrel through our neighborhood on the daily, because we're crisscrossed by highways, is ridiculous. Because we're also impervious surface, almost 80% of our neighborhood is impervious. We flood constantly. I mean, after 10 minutes of rain, our sewer system, which we have a combined sewer overflow system, it cannot handle the rain. So it backs right into the street, and we have what looks like hurricane flooding on the regular in our neighborhood. So it's against this context that we look at the Clean Air Act, right? It's against this context, actually, that we, alongside with colleagues in East Yards in California, we sued EPA recently in order to update some of the clean air standards for incinerators, actually, right? Because even though the Clean Air Act had so many wonderful provisions, EPA wasn't doing its job. It hasn't actually updated a lot of standards that need updating. So I think that that's an example of where communities have been left alone. It doesn't matter that we have wonderful rules and regulations if they're not enforced, if they're not constantly updated. And to me, it's no mistake that the incinerator regulations and rules were left behind when it looked like updating, because incinerators, over 80% of incinerators are in Black and brown communities and low-income communities. So I think regulation's all about who it affects, right? I've seen examples of, like, for instance, we fought recently the Transportation Climate Initiative. people are very worried about emissions coming from cars. I think when you live in a neighborhood like mine, I think about, well, even if you switch to electric cars, where's that electricity coming from? I honestly, for communities like ours, we don't think electrify the grid and everything will be okay, because for us, that just means more power plants. Even in the face of resiliency and talk of climate change, what a lot of industry in our area has resorted to is, well, we'll just build more power plants, right? Like we had the sewage waste treatment facility after Superstorm Sandy. It said, well, we're not safe. And so we're going to build another power plant. That would be the fourth power plant in our neighborhood. And that would be in order so that, they can keep running in an extreme weather situation. They would contribute to the local air quality, which I guess brings me to air quality monitoring. Air quality monitoring for EPA Newark, it's up the hill. Like it's actually all the way up a hill. Not, we're in a low-lying area where the PM 2.5 just it all comes down like a smog and stays in our neighborhood. Our neighborhood smells so bad. You can wake up, especially in the summer, you can imagine what the sewage waste treatment facility, which is open pits of sewage, right? We don't even have a closed facility, what it smells like when it combines with all the other smells. That's what led us to the cumulative impacts law, right? Because for anyone in our neighborhood, they can just look around. And if you look around, you're like, oh, yeah, this was a bad idea. You concentrated a tremendous amount of industry right next to really dense population. I mean, just our neighborhoods, over 60,000 people, right? So, all these facilities I'm talking about, they're walking distance from elementary schools, right? And I forgot Newark Airport, but you just can't get to everything in our neighborhood. And I just stick to what's in our neighborhood, not even right across in Kearney. It's another industrial area. So when we asked like fourth graders, look around, they could say, yeah, you shouldn't add another smokestack. We already have 3 power plants. Don't add a fourth. I think that that's common sense, but that's not how our rules and regulations work. So we had to do the extraordinary organizing work of having our community teach legislators, you should allow our Department of Environmental Protection to look around and not concentrate pollution, right? Because the argument we always hear is this is good for the greater good, right? The greater good means that ambient air quality in the Northeast has gone down, but our localized pollution, and yeah, the toxicity that we're exposed to on the daily has gone up because other neighborhoods want to stay clean. And they're like, well, just put it where it's already dirty. And where it's already dirty is in Black and brown communities. So that continues, of course, the legacies of racism. And the cumulative impacts law is uh, hopefully, an opportunity to start changing that. It only affects new facilities, so it's not going to change things that already exist, but it stops this from being the way that we make siting decisions moving forward. So that's been a tremendously, proud accomplishment for our environmental justice communities on the ground. It was only led by environmental justice communities, in New Jersey. So that was exciting. And we met with the DP every other week for 2 years in order to get the rules right. As far as I'm aware, we're the only state that's gone through the rulemaking process. And we came out with some rock solid rules that folks should look into. So, I'll leave it there, but I would say that when it comes to air quality, we need to take a bottom up approach and not this top down of what's happening. I'm glad for the greater good, but we can't continue sacrificing communities on the ground.
Dr. Wilson, you mentioned that some more things that you want to talk about in this space, and I thought I would offer you the floor.
Oh yeah, no, I don't. Thank you. I think how do we move forward? And Maria presented a strong case for how it should be moved, how we should move forward. I mean, more community-driven efforts that we've had in Maryland, and well, we won't get too much into the laundry with the cumulative impacts, but we've tried, I think, 5 attempts since 2016 or 2015 to pass a cumulative impacts bill. And part of the problem has been, I think the first 3 bills, one was very much community centered, right? Community driven, from a senator from a community, Sheriff Road area that had a concrete facility, I think a transformer, a lot of truck traffic, vehicle traffic, right? And then it got wonky the second go around, and it was watered down to the Reduce Act the third go around. And part of the problem was, in that process in Maryland, folks didn't know what environmental justice was. It was like, oh, we don't know what EJ is. How do we define EJ? And that was 2015, right? So we have these issues where you have folks who really not serious about it, right? And then you fast forward to recent legislation. We have a bill last year that didn't pass. We have this bill this session that's in discussion, being under development. It's not called cumulative impacts because legislators in Maryland are scared to talk about cumulative impacts, even though we have Westmore. We have all these stars aligned, but folks still want to do the same business, as usual, in my opinion, in Maryland. So the current bill doesn't bring in a lot of air quality permits. I don't think it does. It's very it's not inclusive of all the most important air quality permits. And some of the types of facilities that Maria mentioned in her community, if this bill passed, wouldn't it? Some of the facilities wouldn't be covered. Like we have a coal terminal, we have an incinerator, we have a power plant in a community of color. They wouldn't been captured by this bill. So because it's focused primarily on water quality permits, so it just speaks to the difference in how you have more community-driven efforts. And as Maria, I don't think she said it, but what, 10 years, Maria, in getting that legislation passed? So the work that it takes to make EJ causes successful in the face of, big business, in the face of political, not necessarily malfeasance in Maryland, but maybe not enough political will, right? And so that's some of the experiences that we've had, which, and you juxtapose that to what Maria just discussed, but why these efforts to address air quality disparities, whether it be through this report or even some of the climate change and air quality issues that are outlined in the Fifth National Climate Assessment. I was on the air quality team, right? So we see time and time again, if you move from HAPs, to criteria pollutants, if you do it at county level, using satellite data, right? If you're using low cost sensors, if you're using high cost sensors, if you're doing mobile monitoring, you see the same problem. Folks of color are differentially burdened. Folks of color are differentially exposed. As Maria said, you have folks, yes, air quality is improved. We have the Inflation Reduction Act and BIL. How will, in her point, Maria's point about electrification is well taken, because I've been a proponent of it. But if you are doing electrification or other approaches that end up concentrating pollution sources in communities that disproportionately burdened, that's expanding, exacerbating environmental injustice. That is disempowering communities the most impacted, and it's really not living up to the spirit of the Clean Air Act, or even the spirit of what we are in this country as it relates to all this great work that needs to be fully implemented with this current administration. So I think if we don't do more than make sure community voices are heard, excuse me, and how the RA is implemented as a solution framework, excuse me, and also how the BIL is implemented, as Maria said, we're going to see more and more of these issues of communities with EJ issues continuously being impacted and dealing with the negative health inequities, but also the social and economic inequities associated with these air pollution sources and poor decision-making behind the siting of these facilities, even if they're supposed to be renewable, green, and part of our just transition.
Thank you. So, the cumulative emissions laws seem to be, as you indicated, Dr. Wilson, I wouldn't say flourishing, but emerging. And Maria, with yours being the first one actually that has gotten through to the regulatory hurdles, could you? I kind of think everybody here knows what cumulative emission legislation is, but maybe just like, make sure everybody does, because it's really pivotal. And, as Dr. Wilson said, if done well, it can make be a huge solution space, but at the same time, the political will is very difficult to find to make it what it really should be. That's my own words. I'm not speaking for anybody else or Clean Air Task Force, by the way. So could you talk a little bit more about that and what was included in your cumulative emissions legislation and regulations?
Absolutely. And, I wish it went further. When I explain it, it's not actually that impressive. But cumulative impacts, basically, as I said, a fourth grader can stand on a corner and say, there's already too much pollution here, but our regulatory framework was not allowed to do that. You know, it had to judge every facility as an individual. So if this facility is telling me I'm going to put out, you know, 500 tons of NOx, that's okay if that's the limit, and it could go right up to the limit. And so every industry, like in our neighborhood, you know, of course, they go right up to the limit, you know, and they have variances and obviously excursions, as they call them, which I think is offensive. But when they go beyond their limit, which for the case of our incinerator has happened over 800 times in the past few years, right? So these are permits, and they're just for some industries they're suggested limits, right, of how far that they can go. With the cumulative impacts law, it's not about individual facilities, right? So first, cumulative impacts law established that additional review is required if a community is 40% people of color or low income, or non-English speaking, or if they're 35% low income, right? So it accounted for both race and class. And if that is the case, it's determined it's a vulnerable population because New Jersey has been discriminating against these populations for a long time. So additional review is required. That additional review establishes a baseline of pollution where, you know, in a neighborhood like ours, where X amount, the threshold of the baseline for the state. So that includes non-polluted areas. I won't get too in the weeds about that, but it is a wonderfully done formula that I thought was very fair and accounted for heavier concentrations in different populations. Anyway, so if a industry will go over their pollution, if they went up to their limit, if that would bring us over that threshold and increase that pollution burden in our neighborhood, then their application shall be denied. It doesn't say may be denied. It doesn't say, oh, don't worry, we'll fix it up. It says shall be denied, which I think is important operative language. It doesn't leave it up to a speculation. What we've seen in laws like this up to now was that all they had to do was create another, environmental assessment or a cumulative impacts assessment, and they got to do it themselves and rate themselves. This doesn't leave discretion in the industry's hand or in the department's hands. It makes it very clear cut, which I think is what makes the law different. And it does have exceptions, but only for the local host community, right? It's not about, oh, this is a greater good plant, and so for the greater good, we'll sacrifice you. No, it has to be like, if you're putting it in the ironbound, it must benefit the ironbound if we're going to make an exception to the law. And it does not have an economic exception, which is important because in our communities, facilities often buy their way in, they promise a few jobs, and that's that, So, and I also want to speak to hydrogen, right? Hydrogen is going to be the new threat coming into our communities. It's going to increase NOx. We're very worried about it. There are a lot of natural gas plants currently planning conversions to be mixing natural gas with hydrogen in order to power themselves. So we see that as a threat. Like, Dr. Wilson said, the IRA, it bought good, and it also bought a lot of things that our communities must be vigilant coming to the future.
Thank you. So Catherine, your annual report provides an enormous amount of data in this space, and I appreciate how you can get down to granular findings in terms of the impacts of climate change, increasing air quality challenges. So not to put you on the spot, but could you maybe talk a little bit about how your data could inform some of these policies or approaches or solution spaces? Even just by the fact of, getting down to the county level and doing your, annual analysis and historic trends.
Well, I think the most important way that our report contributes at the community level is really is raising public awareness, media awareness, decision maker awareness about the issues of ambient air pollutants and the health effects and the fact of inequities. And because our data doesn't show that, we don't include HAPs, we don't include toxics, or we're only looking at those two criteria pollutants, which are really important. But when you're talking about the communities like the Ironbound, it's not sufficient, obviously, but it can start people asking questions. It can start people thinking about, well, what do we need to know? I mean, we know we live in a polluted community. How do we talk about it? What information do we have that we can supplement the state of the air data with? The other thing that state of the air points out, I think, is the places where there isn't data. The communities where there isn't data. We only have air quality monitors. These are criteria monitors in about a third of the US counties in the United States. And especially with climate change, we're seeing a shift in communities that are being affected primarily by wildfires. So, why doesn't my county have a grade? That's a good public awareness service that we can perform as well.
Great. So we've got a couple questions. We have several questions, but we have two questions that actually kind of lean into, how should I say this? That some of the existing sources of pollution should be, transitioned to less impactful pollution, but not perfect. So, for example, do we need to accept hydrogen and natural gas in lieu of diesel and gasoline as interim measures? Because we can't get to zero petroleum, as quickly as possible. Another example in a question was natural gas is, better than coal, generally speaking, and in terms of emissions, but not methane and NOx. Should natural gas be a temporary approach instead of keeping coal? And I sort of expect that you all have some very interesting things to say about the use of interim, what you might call imperfect approaches. And I'll just, who would like to speak first?
Sounds like a Maria question.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure, I'll take it. But interim, I mean, once you build these multi-million-dollar facilities, they're not like, I don't know who kids themselves that they're interim solutions. If we know where we need to go, I say let's just go there. I honestly, I've talked a lot about this with my community. We rather it take longer and we go to the right direction, take that giant leap forward instead of these incremental steps that we pretend are helping people. Because, you put the natural gas plant up there and pretty soon, I mean, we have a pretty new natural gas plant. It opened up in 2015. It's already racking up violations. It just takes, I feel like it takes the general public mind, puts the general public mind at ease, but it doesn't help local communities, right? We end up with this terrible infrastructure that just becomes the new bad thing, like incinerators. They were an alternative to landfill. We should have just gone to composting and reducing waste overall. But we didn't do that. We said incinerators would be in between, right? And now it's contributing methane gas. We're going to do the same with natural gas or hydrogen or CCS, carbon sequestration. They're all, I think, misleading the public, squandering public dollars and public will, right? People are like, didn't we do something about that? And then they move on to another issue. And communities like ours get left behind when the spotlight's been moved on. So for us, we fight against these, half measures. We want it all. And I think anyone in our position would also, right? When it's actually your life at risk, you would want people to go all the way, not halfway. You wouldn't get half a heart transplant. And I think that's desperately what our society needs.
Yeah, it does seem to be a huge barrier that, what you might say the average public, I don't know who that is, but things they sound good. Like you're busy with the rest of your life. You're not doing a big analysis. You're not reading reports. And you're like, oh, that sounds like a great idea. Like electrification is another example. It's imperfect, right? Depending on the resources that are providing the electricity, right? But when you talk to people who are living in these communities and working in this space, you learn all kinds of new and much more valuable, in my mind, understanding of really what approaches are preferred.
Can I jump in real quick on this, piggyback on Maria's response? Of course, great response, because she's of the community, for the community, by the community. She's a community expert. She's a contextual expert. So the experts who live with the industry should be ones leading the decision making. Again, that's recognitional justice. And we talk about natural gas, that's fossil gas. Natural gas is a euphemism. And when you burn gas, you still get combustion byproducts, right? I mean, that's it's not like you're getting clean air when you burn. You're still getting greenhouse gas emissions. You're getting dangerous co-pollutants that impact public health. So whether it be, these false solutions that Maria outlined, particularly those that are baked into the IRA. I mean, even you look at agricultural communities, we're talking about false solutions of animal waste. I do work with industrial, chicken farms, industrial hog farms. And you lead to, as Maria said, there's an entrenchment of these false solutions, the entrenchment of incinerators, right? You're gonna have the entrenchment of these gas facilities or the ethane cracker facilities or the export facilities. I think Biden did something about LNG exports last week, right? And you also have the liquefied natural gas, sorry for the acronym, and the potential entrenchment of hydrogen. And even, as I say, electrification, as you said, what are the sources? So if you're burning coal, that's not good, right? And whose communities? Again, communities of color, communities who, as Dr. Bullard sometimes says, don't have the complexion for protection, but you have these federal dollars, so they'll have the complexion for investment. As Maria said, the right kinds of investments in real solutions. That's what they deserve. You think about the cumulative impacts issues. We're not talking about stuff that's theoretical, y'all. This is real talk here. This is decades of being dumped on, decades of toxic trauma, right? So this is the right solutions that helps with intergenerational justice. We're talking about hundreds of years for some communities when it talks front. You think about waterfront infrastructure, hazardous infrastructure, right? And for Maria's community, of course, Cancer Alley, Richmond, California, and you think about, again, electrification and lithium and how the extractive industries impact the indigenous brothers and sisters, they won't have measures. So we're gonna invest, as Maria said, invest in the real solutions and not the false solutions. And again, from an economic efficiency perspective, externalities perspective, you produce less externalities, social, environmental, economic. It's more beneficial to public health and community health long term. It's less waste of our dollars. And this is the people's money, supposedly with the RA and the BIL. So the people's money wants the people's solutions. Okay, I'll stop.
Yeah, and Jenna, if I could, because I don't want it to be heard as I'm against electrification. I just think electrification was starting at the wrong place, right? Of course, policymakers will do that. They're sitting in an office, breathing in good air, probably looking outside at trees, right? We have less than 5% tree coverage in our neighborhood. But what I meant is we shouldn't have started on electrifying people's cars. We should have started by cleaning up the grid. And that's why how we're going to define clean energy really matters going into the future. Because right now, clean energy is anything that doesn't produce greenhouse gases. But we need to really think about other criteria, air pollutants, right? And that's actually the definition we're trying to push for in New Jersey, is that it wouldn't just be defined by greenhouse gases. It would also include lead, mercury, those other things that hurt us, NOx, particulate matter. And if they're producing that, like hydrogen will, then it shouldn't be considered green. And then we can call politicians bluff. We can call the fossil fuel trying to extend its life and call it for what it is, just more dirty energy. So thank you for that.
Absolutely. So these are two potential policies that could be very helpful in this space, right? I mean, you have it in New Jersey for your cumulative impacts, policies, and then an accurate definition of clean energy, right? I mean, right now it really is only about, in the minds of many, greenhouse gas pollution. And that's sort of a way of actually really even further keeping a lot of communities behind from where they should be enjoying clean air. So does anybody have any last comments? And then just for those of you who we didn't get to your questions, if you want to put your email in the Q&A, I'll do my best to respond to them elsewhere. So, but does anybody have any last comments? Any one of you, or certainly have been really, really insightful and I know you have a million things everybody here could be doing today on your advocacy, and really appreciate it. But last
I have
statement.
a comment, Jeanette, just as Maria's comment. And maybe say this way: are they really unintended consequences, right? Of some of these, you know, these are things you kind of know, right? What's going to happen, and we see these piloting or the testing people, you know, these are intended. It's not by accident, right? So how are we going to make sure we don't have these intended consequences or these structured consequences from these new infrastructures as we're talking about? Because we can see it. Maria said we see it. We've been there before. We've seen this before, right? So I think not, again, the recognition of justice, not listen to folks like Maria and folks in her communities and other communities across the country who are dealing with these environmental insults, you know, this oppression, this toxic trauma, to inform the right policy decisions and make sure they're there when the policy decisions are being made, and not, you know, folks who, as Maria said, or I like to say Maria, or who they go home, they drink a latte, they good either way, looking outside, looking at the trees, right? That is not good use of recognition of justice. The decision making on what types of energy infrastructure as we move to this just transition, that to me has to be, again, as a priority or a recommendation. We have to do better in that front.
Great.
Because I feel like we're having the same conversation every decade. It was a decade ago. What was the clean air? What was the climate change? You got to jump on the train, EJ groups. You got to jump on the train. EJs keep having to jump on. No. We had to stop doing that. So whether it be the hydrogen train or, you know, some other trains that folks want us to jump on, that has to be. We have to do a different way of, you know, with environmental and politics and energy politics, pollution politics, and really get to justice. Right? How do we really center justice, right, Maria? I'm stealing from the symposium last week. Or was that 2 weeks ago? How do you really center justice in these policy solutions?
Thank you. Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Pargo, for a great paper and underscoring all these important facts. And Veronica did a best job ever I've seen on the Clean Air Act representation. And Catherine and Dr. Wilson and Maria, thank you again for all your time and attention and your great work in this space. So Happy New Year, and let's keep working. Take care.